Hello, dear readers. Welcome to Novel Spotlight. This is an audiobook of the novel The Midnight Library by Matt Haig. Part 7. Chapter 13. Regret Overload. She had met Dan while living with Izzy in Tooting. Big smile, short beard. Visually a TV vet, fun, curious. He drank quite a bit but always seemed immune to hangovers. He had studied art history and put his in-depth knowledge of Rubens and Tintoretto to incredible use by becoming head of PR for a brand of protein flapjacks. He did, however, have a dream, and his dream was to run a pub in the countryside. A dream he wanted to share with Nora, and she got carried away with his enthusiasm, got engaged, but suddenly she had realized she didn't want to marry him. Deep down, she was scared of becoming her mother. She didn't want to replicate her parents' marriage. Still staring blankly at the book of regrets, she wondered if her parents have ever been in love or they have got married because marriage was something you did at the appropriate time with the nearest available person. A game where you grabbed the first person you could find when the music stopped. She had never wanted to play that game. Bertrand Russell wrote that to fear love is to fear life, and to those who fear life are already 3 parts dead. Maybe that was her problem. Maybe she was scared of living. Maybe Bertrand Russell had more marriages and affairs than hot dinners, so perhaps he was no one to give advice. When her mom died 3 months before the wedding, Nora's grief was immense. Though she had suggested that the date would be put back, it somehow never was, and Nora's grief fused with depression and anxiety and the feeling that her life was out of her own control. The wedding seemed such a symptom of this chaotic feeling that she felt tied to a train track, and the only way she could loosen the rope and free herself was to pull out of the wedding. Though, in reality, staying in Bedford and being single and letting Izzy down about their Australia plan and started working at string theory and getting a cat had all felt like the opposite of freedom. "Oh no," said Mrs. Elm, breaking Nora's thought. "It's too much for you." And suddenly she was back feeling all this contrition, all that pain of letting people down and letting herself down, the pain she had tried to escape less than an hour ago. The regrets began to storm together. In fact, while staring at the open pages of the book, the pain was actually worse than it had been wandering around Bedford. The power of all the regrets simultaneously emanating from the book was becoming agony. The weight of the guilt and remorse and sorrow too strong. She leaned back on her elbows, dropped the heavy book, and squeezed her eyes shut. She could hardly breathe, as if invisible hands were around her neck. "Make it stop." "Close it now," instructed Mrs. Elm. "Close the book. Not just your eyes. Close it. You have to do it yourself." So Nora, feeling like she was about to pass out, sat back up and placed her hand under the front cover. It felt even heavier now, but she managed to close the book and gasped in relief. Chapter 14. Every life begins now. Well, Mrs. Elm had her arms folded. Though she looked identical to the Mrs. Elm Nora had always known, her manners were definitely a little more brusque. It was Mrs. Elm, but also somehow not Mrs. Elm. It was quite confusing. "Well, what?" Nora said, still gasping. Still relieved, she could no longer feel the intensity of her regrets simultaneously. "Which regret stands out? Which decision you would like to undo? Which life would you like to try on?" She said that precisely, "try on," as if this was a clothes shop and Nora would choose a life as easy as a t-shirt. It felt like a cruel game. That was agony. I felt like I was about to be strangled. What is the point of this? As Nora looked up, she noticed the light for the first time. Just naked bulbs hanging down from the wires attached to the ceiling, which seems like a normal kind of light grey ceiling. Except it was the ceiling that reached no walls. Like the floor here, it went on forever. The point is, there is a strong possibility that your whole life is over. You wanted to die, and maybe you will. And you will need somewhere to go, somewhere to land another life. So you need to think hard. This library is called the Midnight Library because every new life on offers here begins now. And now is midnight. It begins now. All these futures. That's what is here. That's what your book represents. Every other immediate, present, and ongoing future you could have had. So there are no past in there? No, just the consequence of them. But those books are also written, and I know them all. But they are not for you to read. And when does each life end? It could be seconds or hours, or it could be days, months, more. If you have found a life you truly want to live, then you get to live it until you die of old age. If you really want to live a life hard enough, you don't have to worry. You will stay there as if you have always been there. Because in one universe, you have always been there. The book will never be returned, so to speak. It becomes less of a loan and more of a gift. The moment you decide you want that life, really want it, then everything that exists in your head now, including this midnight library, will eventually be a memory so vague and intangible it will hardly be there at all. One of the lights flickered overhead. The only danger, continued Mrs. Elm more ominously, is when you are here, between lives. If you lose the will to carry on, it will affect your root life, your original life, and that could lead to destruction of this place. You'd be gone forever, you'd be dead, and so would your access to all this. That's what I want. I want to be dead. I would be dead because I want to be. That's why I took the overdose. I want to die. Well, maybe or maybe not. After all, you're still here. Nora tried to get her head around this. So, how do I return to the library if I'm stuck in a life even worse than the one I have just left? It can be subtle, but as soon as the disappointment is felt in full, you'll come back here. Sometimes the feeling creeps up, other times it comes all at once. If it never arrives, you will stay put and you will be happy there by definition. It couldn't be simpler. So, pick something you would have done differently and I will find you the book. That is to say, the life. She remembered chatting late at night with Dan about his dream of owning a quaint little pub in the country. His enthusiasm had been infectious and it had almost become her dream too. I wish I hadn't left Dan and that I was still in relationship with him. I regret us not staying together and working toward that dream. Is there a life where we are still together? Of course, said Mrs. Elm. The books in the library began to move again, as though the shelves were conveying bells. This time, though, instead of going as slow as a wedding march, they moved faster and faster and faster, until they couldn't really be seen as individual books at all. They just whirled by in streams of green. Then, just as suddenly, they stopped. Mrs. Elm crouched down and took a book from the lowest shelf to her left. The book was one of the darker shades of green. She handed it to Nora. It was a lot lighter than the Book of Regrets, even though it was similar size. Again, there was no title on the spine, but a small one embossed on the front, precisely the same shade as the rest of the book. It said, "My life." But it's not my life. Oh, Nora, they are all your life. What do I do now? You open the book and turn to the first page. Nora did so. Okay. said Mrs. Elm with careful precision. "Now read the first line." Nora stared down and read. She walked out of the pub in the cool night air. And Nora had just enough time to think to herself, "Pub?" After that, it was happening. The text began to swirl and soon became indecipherable in fast motion as she felt herself weaken. She never knowing let go of the book, but there was a moment where she was no longer a person reading it, and a consequent moment where there was no book or library at all. For the next part, stay tuned to Novel Spotlight. And please like, share, and subscribe.